Funding for Off 90 is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Cruising your way next, Off 90. A Vietnam vet talks about his experiences in the Marines during the war. Meet a man who knows the back roads of southeastern Minnesota like the back of his hand. Handcrafted humidors. Plus, the fall of wheat and spring of milk in Freeborn County. Your next stop, Off 90. Hi, I'm Barbara Keith. Thanks for joining me on this journey of Off 90. Ray King joined the Marines before the Vietnam War really started heating up. He got married shortly after signing up for the Corps, but his honeymoon was cut short by the U.S. government. We talked with Ray about his experience in Vietnam and what it was like to return.
I'm Ray King, Vietnam veteran, United States Marine Corps. Back in January '64 when I went in, it wasn't a hot conflict at that point. Originally, of course, I went to MCRD, Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego. My wife and I, of course, were dating. We were high school sweethearts, and we decided the year before that we were going to get married. I had to go to my CO, my captain in charge of the battery, and ask permission to get married. I was only 20 years old. He said, yes, you can do that. We got married. We went on a honeymoon and returned from the honeymoon. And there was a telegram waiting there for me. My leave was canceled, and to get back as quick as possible. Within a couple weeks, I was on board ship, leaving from San Diego on LST, which is a landing, LST means landing ship tank. There was excitement and adrenaline going, but not afraid. I wasn't afraid at that point. I was very confident in our capabilities and our training. I felt we could pretty well handle anything that was thrown at us. The ships pulled up onto the shore, and they opened the doors, and we just got our equipment out onto the beach. Well, about that time it was dark. There's 100 and some Marines out there stumbling around and not knowing where we were at. Just stumbling around in the bush and so forth. And we finally made it to an area that was clear enough where we could circle the wagon, so to speak. And they said, okay, go dig holes. And Marines are good at digging holes. We practiced that a lot. So we dug holes, and the gunny just said, get in the hole, be ready, be quiet, because we didn't have any protection other than the holes we were digging. And then there was a Marine outfit about probably a mile and a half away that was getting clobbered all night long. And we could do nothing. It was frustrating because we could do nothing to help, because we didn't know what was in between them and us. And we just kind of sat and watched a light show. We were a self-propelled artillery outfit, okay? They would set up what they call a sweep. They determined that there was a possibility of making contact with the enemy in a certain location. And so they would send out Marines, it could be anywhere from a platoon to a company, to wander around, if you will, out there in the jungle and in the hills, until hoping that they might run into some North Vietnamese or VC and pick a fight. But once the fight started, that's when we were, of course, there to support the infantry troops that were then helicoptered in. The first couple weeks, you're pretty nervous, but eventually you adapt to the conditions and to the heat and the bugs and everything else that's going on. There's people out there that mean to do you harm. And once you get that accepted in your mind, you settle into an everyday process of just going through the day and doing your job, making sure you did your job. The nervousness settles down, except of course when something happens, then adrenaline kicks in again and you're back up there again. The enemy always knew where you were, because you were always surrounded. They would do things, of course, sniper fire was a daily thing. Sometimes they would sit outside your wire and rattle the wire and smoke cigarettes. You know, you could, just to harass you, in some cases, trying to get you to give away your location. We have these vehicles called Ontos. That's a small track vehicle with 6 recoilless rifles, 3 on each side. And usually they were interspersed in the convoy. And they charged out from the convoy, and they went out maybe 100 yards or so, and they spotted where the fire was coming from. And it was almost surreal. And wherever that round went from the spotter rifle, which was a tracer, that's where the round was coming out of that recoilless rifle, rocket. And bam, they let them have it. In their own length, they could do a neutral turn and come back into the convoy, and off we go again. It was those kind of things that happened in short periods of time that you contemplate later in life as to, boy, what really happened there, and how did they were so in unison. It was like they were all had one brain. We did our jobs. We talked about things at night in the hole. I mean, we spent most of our nights in foxholes and bunkers. Yeah, we'd talk about some of the things that were going on, but most of the time you wanted to talk about happy things, good things, girlfriends and R&R. And I did not know what was going on back here in 1966. We didn't have radios to listen to. We didn't even have electricity. We didn't have newspapers. And when you came back as an individual. You never came back as a unit like they did in the other wars. And so when I came back on an airplane with 100 and some guys I didn't know. They didn't know me. So you're coming back by yourself. When I came back, I was told the night before and didn't get a chance to say goodbye to anybody. Most of the guys that I'd gone over there with had already left. In fact, I was the last one of the original group to go. We landed together. I was the last one to leave. We got there and to El Toro Marine Base. They gave us our orders and they gave us some money. And they said, you can't wear a uniform. And that's when it really hit me. What is going on here? But I didn't care at that point. I wanted to go home. You know, I'd been married over a year, 14 months, and I'd seen her for 6 days, you know. I wanted to go home. I feel proud that I was in the Marine Corps. I feel proud that I did what I was asked of me. Sometimes I don't feel so proud of how Vietnam vets were treated coming back. Yeah, there was a lot of protesting going on, but for most of us that came home, there was silence. And that was hurtful, for sure. But there would be that silence. Nobody wanted to talk. Nobody cared, it seemed like. I've started writing about maybe 4.5 years ago. And my wife has urged me to do that. I still don't talk about it very much. But in my writing, I feel like I can put it all down there. And I have time to analyze what I'm saying and how I'm saying it to make sure that I say it the way I want them to hear it, rather than bits and pieces. I want them to understand, to get a different perspective of not only being there was about, but afterwards, the silence. It was 30 years after I came back where a total stranger welcomed me home.
Award-winning journalist John Weiss covered southeast Minnesota for the Rochester Post-Bulletin for more than 10 years. He accomplished this by driving down back roads, making stops in small towns, and writing about the things he saw and the people he met. We talked with John about his book, Back Roads, which reprints some of his favorite articles.
Well, it had a lot to do with pink plastic flamingos. Just west of Elgin, there was a woman who always had this big flock of pink plastic flamingos out. Big hats, big sunglasses, just really funny. I went, there's a story there. There's got to be a story there. I worked for the Rochester Post-Bulletin from November of '75 until technically retiring at the end of September 2016. And so I suggested we start a column, and I said, well, I drive around the back roads a lot, let's call it Back Roads. How many times have I been on this road? Hundreds, certainly in the hundreds. But I was out all day quite often. We call it going to the river, which eventually means I was out of the office and the editors never quite were sure where I was, but I'd come back with 3 or 4 good stories and pictures, and so they didn't question it. I mean, it was fun. I really enjoyed it. This guy had an beautiful old barn, and they wanted to have a retirement home, and instead of tearing the barn down, they had the Amish refurbish it, and they did a beautiful job, and it's right up the road here. Another time I was at the Elba Fire Tower. They have like 600 and some steps up to the top of the Elba Fire Tower, and you could buy steps. You put your name on. They had the Siebenallers, the Kronebusch, the usual names in the Whitewater Valley, and then there was one brand new one. I looked at it, and I looked and went, wow, this is crazy. A guy had proposed to his girlfriend on the steps. He had got a stepmate, Wendy, will you marry me? And the Wendy was spelled W-E-N-D-I, and so didn't tell her. They were walking up, and she was walking in front, and she was looking at all these steps, and all of a sudden she went, Wendy, that's how I spell my name. Wendy, will you marry me? And she turns around, and there her boyfriend is on his knee with a ring. What a great story, just because I noticed something a little different. The better I understood the story, the deeper it was in my head, the faster I would write. I would sometimes do 15 minutes for a 600-word story. No problem. Once it was in my head, I just could type it out. And another thing I found out, if I had it in my head really well, I had very few typos. Whereas if I wasn't sure, I'd have a lot of typographical errors. So I could tell just from my writing whether or not it'd be a good story. And another guy emailed me and said that he went to visit his mother every week in a nursing home near Rochester. And the first thing she would ask him is, did you read Back Roads? And he had to talk to her about Back Roads. I never knew people responded that way. As a reporter, like I said, we don't get a lot of, unless something goes wrong, we don't get a lot of feedback. But apparently they really liked it. So, yeah, it's fun. In Plainview, I ran into Tom Driscoll, who is the publisher of Shipwreck Books, and he published this book. There's a lot of really good stories in this book. In fact, here's the one about that Elba Fire Tower. And there's one here, the world's smallest restrooms right here. They really should get out there again. They're worth reading a second time. And so he and I talked, and we talked to the Post Bowl and said, yeah, let's get together. Most people, first they're kind of shy, and the usual question is, why do you want to do a story on me? You know, I'm just a common, whatever it is. And I said, that's why I want to do a story on you, just because this is a real story. You're authentic. And I got a lot of really good stories out of them. People just start talking, and one of the odd reactions, I don't know if it's odd, but people say later on, huh, I didn't know I was that interesting. But they have interesting lives. Why don't you get them going?
Edward Sallee of Albert Lea owns his own business called Waxing Moon Wood. His specialty is making high-quality, handcrafted humidors. Ed prides himself on a hand-fitted interior that is virtually airtight to maintain his customers' prized cigars at optimum humidity. We talked with Ed while he was working on another marvelous creation.
The waxing moon is basically coming from a new moon into a full moon is when the moon is in the waxing phase. Very much like working with woodworking projects. You have a rough piece of lumber, which would be the new moon, and then the waxing moon brings it on into a full moon type situation. So that's why I call it waxing moon wood. I'm Ed Sallee and I'm a craftsman. I build custom boxes primarily and mostly cigar humidors. I took an interest in woodworking and started in 1992 and started out working on the big things like everybody wants to do. And I built a couple of boxes and I built jewelry boxes and I liked how it didn't take as much wood and you could buy better wood. You could buy more expensive exotic wood to make nicer looking things. So I went with that and built a lot of jewelry boxes for friends and family, and eventually everybody wound up with a jewelry box and I wanted to keep doing it. So I wanted to find something that I could market, and cigar humidors seems to be a perfect fit for what I like to build. A lot of my customers browse through my website and they request different species, and then I try to pair up wood that goes with that species. For example, maple with the contrast of ebony on this box. And maple and walnut always go well together. And you just try to find a combination that works. We just basically narrow down what it is they're looking for in a humidor, and then I take it from there and translate that into the humidor itself. A lot of times I don't know who I'm talking with. I've got my humidors on 6 continents, so it's hard to imagine the breadth of the audience out there that that has interest in my boxes. It's humbling. A lot of my projects are requested by people that are gifting them to somebody, and those projects, I think every one of them, I try to translate what they're feeling about into that box. I built one for a guy who, as he ordered it, his father went in for a heart transplant, and there's a cigar out there called My Father, so I made a cigar band lid and put a My Father cigar label in the corner. A to B of building a humidor is, obviously you have to determine the size and determine the wood that you're going to use. And, just to sum it up in one point, measure twice, cut once. That's a rule of thumb for all woodworking, and same thing with the boxes. You just have to measure, sometimes I measure 3 or 4 or 5 times, because a 64th of an inch gap on a box would be like the Grand Canyon compared to a dresser having that same 64th inch gap. So really just have to measure and double check before you cut. And the rest of it's just putting it together and seeing what else you can do to make it look better. And there's a lot of different things you can do. The way that I came up with the design and general design for my boxes are, I use the golden ratio for the dimensions. So basically, proportionally, this box is the same as this box, is the same as this box, is the same as this box. So using the golden ratio, I think gives it more of an appeal just by looking at it. There's a large humidor upstairs that is a custom design for a fellow that had ordered from me before. His first challenge was an octagon-shaped humidor, which turned out really nice. A couple years went by, he contacted me and said he had purchased a Macintosh Willow chair, which he wanted me to emulate with a humidor. And that humidor is upstairs, and the process behind that was, you'll have to see the design, but in order to make it as such, I had to make it as big as it is, because working with any smaller pieces than what are on there would have been very difficult. So I think the squares on it are a 1/2 inch, and they're alternating into a pattern on all 4 sides, and it took me a very long time to do. Here. Probably the most significant thing that I did was the flag cases for the pilot of United Airlines 175 who went down in infamy on September 11th, 2001. I built a flag case for the wife, the 2 daughters, and the mother, and presented them to them. I would say that I get involved with each project that I do.
Freeborn County was established in 1855. It is named for William Freeborn, an early Minnesota politician. From its beginning, Freeborn County was chiefly agrarian. However, the taste for what farmers produced has changed with the times.
With the decline of wheat prices in the late 1870s, farmers turned to dairying. Freeborn County's first dairy processing firm, Fountain Lake Creamery, started May 11, 1881. with milk and cream from 200 cows. The dairies eliminated the objectionable features of making butter on the farm. Profits, instead of losses, were enjoyed by both the owners and patrons. The Clarks Grove Creamery Association, which opened in 1890, was the first cooperative creamery in Freeborn County. The farmers provided the milk and cream, controlled the operations, and received dividends based on the profit of the cooperative. Creameries in Freeborn County continued to flourish. By 1896, there were 24 creameries. Butter was a major export of Freeborn County, with New York being one of its markets. In the spring of 1897, the Albert Lea Dairy Association installed new equipment for pasteurizing milk. The following year, the U.S. Agricultural Department shipped Albert Lea's butter to England, looking to establish a new market. In 1911, the state of Minnesota purchased the Albert Lea Dairy Association's plant to create an experiment station in the center of the richest dairying section of the state. According to the 1910 report of the Dairy and Food Commissioner of the state of Minnesota, Freeborn County had 28 creameries with more than 27,000 cows. More than 5 million pounds of butter were produced that year. The population of milk cows kept increasing until it reached its peak of 39,500 in 1942. Then, the number of milk cows began to slowly decline. Creameries gradually discontinued operations, and the last creamery in Freeborn County closed its doors in 1999. This story of the past was brought to you by the Freeborn County Historical Society.
We've reached the end of this episode's tour Off 90. Thanks for riding along. See you next time. Off 90.
Funding for Off 90 is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.